Thank you, Charles, for that great introduction, and also to Kelly and to everyone here at the Asia Society for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here in Houston, and thank you all for coming to listen to me in what appears to have been an unseasonable downstorm today. It was funny when I got on, I live in Seattle, Washington, and when I got on the plane in Seattle yesterday, it was bright and sunny, and I get off the plane this morning in Houston, and it's a downpour, so maybe bad timing on my part. But I'm excited to be here today to talk to you all about India and Prime Minister Modi. And before I get into the topic, I want to tell you a little story about my time at the National Security Council. As Charles mentioned, I was a senior director there for almost 3 years. And one of the great privileges that we have in the National Security Council is to brief the president when he has to make phone calls and when he has meetings with foreign leaders. And I'd like to tell you a story about February of 2009. It was my first encounter with Barack Obama as president. And he had been president for all of 3 weeks, still had rock star status, hadn't messed anything up yet, no big fights. So still this sort of walk-on-water figure. And he's about to make a phone call to the president of Pakistan, at the time, President Zardari. And I get ushered into his office to brief him on the topic. And we do the briefing, and the briefing goes fine. He asked a few questions. But then there's some technical difficulties connecting the call to Islamabad. And so me and my colleague and the president were sitting there with nothing to do. And then he starts chit-chatting with us. And at this point, I get very nervous because I was not prepared to chit-chat, right? When Barack Obama starts chit-chatting with you, everyone gets nervous. And he asked me where I was from. And I grew up in Iowa. And I said to the president, I said, "I'm from Iowa, sir." And his face just lit up. He starts beaming, and he says, "Iowa? That's fantastic. What part of Iowa?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from Iowa City." And he says, "That's really great. That's really great that you're from Iowa." And then, keep in mind, I was very, very nervous, first time meeting the president. And I said the same thing that I say to everyone when I tell them where I'm from. I said, "Oh, have you been, sir?" And he pauses. From whatever he was doing at his desk, he looks up at me and he says, "Well, I did do a lot of campaigning there last year." And I wanted to crawl into a shell and die. And then he paused, he looked up at me again, and as if to turn the knife in my back, he said, "Well, I think I know every nook and cranny of Iowa by now." And at which point, I basically died of embarrassment. I'm sure at that point the president was thinking, who have we got here on national security staff? So that aside, I had to work my way back into the good graces of the president and demonstrate that I did know a little bit something about national security. And so that's why I want to come here tonight and talk to you about Prime Minister Modi. Now, as Charles mentioned, Prime Minister Modi has been a transformative figure thus far in Indian politics. Elected in 2014 in a historic election last May, in a landslide victory, he has an unprecedented mandate to carry out his vision, and he's really started implementing it. And so I want to tell you about his pragmatism and his policies and how he's positioning India. But the story about Prime Minister Modi doesn't begin in 2014. It actually begins in the late 90s. And so I want to take you back a little bit to set the stage for what allowed Prime Minister Modi to come to power in such a thunderous manner. If you recall, in the late 90s, the leadership in India was very unstable. They had a succession of governments that some of them lasted 13 days, some of them lasted a few months, but a lot of really quick turnover. A lot of people were wondering if India was going to slide into being a failed state or if it was going to really transform itself into one of the premier countries in the world. Up until that point, India had primarily been ruled by one party, the Congress Party, ever since it was founded. And for most of that time, it was ruled by one family, starting with Jawaharlal Nehru, as you all know, and then passing the torch to Indira Gandhi and then Rajiv Gandhi, and on into the 90s. But in the late 90s, a small up-and-coming political party called the BJP really made a push for power, and they took power in 1998 with a prime minister by the name of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And Vajpayee went about really changing the fabric of India. He became a very bold and visionary leader. He really opened India up. He started interacting with foreign countries on more of an equal basis. And he really set the stage for a lot of the reforms and the growth that India would see in the early 2000s. Now, the issue with Vajpayee's term is that he had all of this incredible growth, but he forgot about India's rural population. And so in 2004, when he was running for re-election, everyone thought that Vajpayee would win re-election hands down. In fact, I was in the State Department at the time, and it never crossed any of our minds that Vajpayee would lose. In fact, all of our policy papers, all of our strategy documents, they all assumed that Vajpayee would be returning to power and we would move forward. So in 2004, what happens? You have a surprising defeat, right? The Congress Party comes into power in 2004, and no one expects this to happen. Even the Congress Party itself. They admitted that they weren't ready to really assume power when the election results came in because they didn't expect to win. And so this goes back to Vajpayee forgetting about India's poor. The vast majority of India at the time was still a rural population, and they had been left behind by the economic reforms that Vajpayee was touting. He had a campaign theme that was called India Rising. And India really was rising at the time, but only for the urban elite. And that resulted in a shocking election defeat for Vajpayee. So you have the Congress Party, after this experiment with the BJP, you have the Congress Party coming back to power. And what do? They install a technocrat as prime minister. And you recall the previous prime minister, Manmohan Singh, he was not a politician. To this day, he has never won an election in his entire life, yet he was the leader of the world's biggest democracy. And it was a different kind of governance. It was a governance of, we're going to be technically competent, we're going to implement economic reforms, we're going to focus on what India needs, and we're not going to focus as much on the politics. And Singh's time in office for 10 years total is really a tale of two terms. In 2004, when he started, he really took some bold visionary steps. He instituted a lot of economic reforms. They were a continuation of the reforms that he, frankly, started in the early 90s when he was finance minister. And he started the US-India civil nuclear deal, as Charles talked about in the intro, which really was a landmark treaty between the two countries that set the stage for increased cooperation between the two countries. And so he took a lot of really bold visionary steps. And in 2009, when he was running for re-election, he won again, the Congress Party won again, and Prime Minister Singh became the first prime minister since the 1970s to win re-election after serving a full term. So he himself was a very historic prime minister. There was a time when everyone talked about Prime Minister Singh as the new blood of India. And so here we are in 2009. The prime minister has just been re-elected. He's had a great first term. Everything seems to be going great. A brand new president in Washington. He really focused on India, invites Prime Minister Singh to Washington for his first ever state dinner, visits India in 2010. Things seem great. But unfortunately, that's not how it turned out. As the second term of Prime Minister Singh's time in office dragged on, he was really beset by a number of corruption scandals that undermined his power. And since he was not sort of a natural politician, many perceived him to be a very weak leader because he was not able to take on the people that were corrupt in his administration. He was not able to speak forcefully against the things that were happening. And even more than that, the Congress Party ran out of ideas. In the last 2 years of office, they generally did not have any new ideas that they were willing to push. They became much more focused on retaining power rather than exercising power and wielding power. So maybe 10 years in office was a little bit too long for them. They were hobbled by scandal. They were not able to implement any ideas. They just seemed like an old, tired party. And so that sets the stage for the 2014 election in India. And then Chief Minister Modi of Gujarat, he sets a campaign theme that is focused relentlessly on economic growth and progress. And he really electrifies India, and he electrifies the political landscape. He ran on his record of achievement in Gujarat, where he was chief minister for 13 years before assuming national office. And what's more important, he ran against the corruption of the Congress Party. As I said, they were seen as old and stodgy, not really be able to offer a bright future for India. And so all that comes together. So you have this relatively young, energetic candidate bringing new life into politics against an old party that has been in power too long with an unpopular leader. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Does this happen in any other countries we know of recently? That's right. 2008, and Barack Obama. And the feeling in India in 2014, in the lead up to the election, was very similar to the feeling in the United States in 2008. A brand new leader who was willing to take the country in a new direction. And so Modi and his party, the BJP, they have a landslide victory. And everyone assumed that Modi was going to win. But I don't think anyone predicted that he would have this much of a majority in Parliament. He's, like I said, the first outright majority in the lower house of Parliament since Rajiv Gandhi in the 1980s. No one predicted that. So there really was an appetite and a desire for change when Modi was elected. And now he has an unprecedented mandate to implement his vision. So let's talk about his vision a little bit. What has he done since taking office? He took office in May last year. He's been in office about 8 months. And what has he done? Well, so far he has focused relentlessly on economic reforms, just like his campaign themes. When he took office, he might as well have put up a sign at the New Delhi airport and the Bombay airport and Hyderabad and everywhere that said, India, open for business. And that is what he's really trying to do, is attract foreign investment into India. Because he realizes that for India to have the kind of growth rates that he wants, to pull their poor population out of poverty and into the middle class, he needs to have blistering growth. And foreign investment is one of the ways to do it. There are two things he's focused on with foreign investment. One is meeting the needs of his own people. India has a population of 1.2 billion people and growing fast. I think the statistic that's commonly cited is that India adds the equivalent of an Australia every year. So they have a huge burgeoning population. And they need stuff like steel, aluminum, refrigerators, motorcycles, cars, all these things that India has thus far not really produced domestically. And so he wants to meet that demand for his population to allow them to have this economic development. Secondly, he wants to focus India's industries on what he calls entirely new industries. Modi looked at the models that other countries have taken over the past several decades. He looked at Japan in the 1980s when they really built up their automobile industry and had a lot of success. He looked at China and Taiwan and really their growth in the electronics industries and computers and microchips. And he realizes that India cannot really take over China and Japan in terms of being a hub for this types of production and industry. So he wants to transform India into what he calls new industries: solar panels, LED lighting, small cars, medical appliances, even weapons. These are the things that he's focused on. And he wants to bring foreign companies in to invest in his country to start building this stuff in India. The other thing he's been focusing on is openness to free trade, much more so than his predecessor has been. He's shown that he's willing to engage with foreign countries and the world community on trade issues, but he's doing it on India's terms. Gone are the days when India will be pushed around by the Western countries and sort of telling them what to do. He's not going to sort of sit back and let the other powers decide what are the most preferable free trade arrangements. And the best demonstration of this is the World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement this past year. In July of 2014, out of 191 countries, India was the only one to reject agreement. And since agreement requires consensus, Prime Minister Modi effectively vetoed a global agreement that would have facilitated trade around the world. And why did he do this? He did this because the terms of the agreement would have undermined India's agricultural sector. And so this is Modi very pragmatically taking the lessons of the previous BJP administration, Vajpayee, and making sure that folks in rural India have the same opportunities that the urban elite do. And he is not going to do anything to undermine the agricultural production and the agricultural farmers. And Modi came under immense criticism for his role in July 2014, but he stuck to his guns. He didn't relent. And what happened eventually is that in November last year, the United States, the UK, the European Union, all of whom were not too happy with the prime minister at the time, they finally relented and accepted India's terms. And that's when the trade facilitation agreement finally came to fruition. And so it's a good demonstration that the Prime Minister Modi, he's open to free trade, but he's going to do it in a manner that serves India's purposes and protects his own interests and his own sectors that are important to India. The other thing he's focused on is decreasing regulations internal to India. He's launched this campaign called Make in India campaign, which really is designed to attract businesses and cut a lot of red tape. One of the things that I've read about that he's done is he's cut the time to obtain a business license I forget the exact numbers, but it used to take weeks or months to get a business license in India, and now that's been cut to a number of days. So he really is focused on making it easier for companies to set up shop. He's also increased the limit on foreign investment in India. It used to be that companies, when they wanted to come in to India, could only own 25% of the company that they were investing in, which effectively meant they had to find a local partner and trust that partner to run their business with their money. But now that those caps have been lifted to much higher rates, it's much more incentive for companies to come into India. And so you see him focusing on economic reform in a very pragmatic way, and this pragmatism extends even to his foreign policy, which are being influenced a lot by business interests. If you look at the countries that he's reached out to already, they're very much focused on trade and foreign investment. Within a few months of taking office, Modi took a grand tour of East Asia. And if you look at the countries that he visited, they were all focused on countries that could provide India with something, with companies, with investment. Japan, Bangladesh, Australia. He even went to China. And there he didn't talk about issues related to human rights or issues that are sort of maybe not high on his priority list, but he talked about trade. What can your companies come? What can they do? And this has happened even with the United States, and it's really been the spark plug for the relationship. I'll get into the U.S.-India relationship in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but just note here that Prime Minister Modi moved very quickly to patch up the relationship when he took office. It was in a very bleak environment when he took power in May of 2014, and people were talking openly about a huge rupture in the relationship. And Modi had every reason to continue this rupture. The United States had denied him entry to the country for almost 10 years. They pulled his visa because of some controversies in Gujarat when he was chief minister. And so he could have kept a grievance and said, this country has really treated me awfully. I am not going to do business with this country. But again, his pragmatism took over. He knew that he needed the United States to have a robust economic growth rate, and he has been courting that. His summit in September, when he came to the United States, really very much focused on trade. Similarly with Israel, he's moved quickly to strengthen his relationship with Israel. But again, this is focused on the economy and more on defense purchases and weapons sales. India is the largest importer of defense procurement in the world. And Modi is very focused on making sure that high-tech weapons equipment is available to India. And the other thing he's really focused on bringing to India is energy resources. As I said, India has 1.2 billion people and growing, and they have a huge energy appetite going forward over the next several decades. And Modi knows that he's not going to be able to meet that demand domestically. He's going to need to get it from outside sources. And so he's been going around the world trying to find right energy sources that can meet India's growing demand and allow it to have economic growth. So you have pragmatism driving economic policy. You have pragmatism driving his foreign policy. And on other domestic policy issues, you also see this streak of pragmatism that's going through in everything that he's been doing. The first is his focus on the plight of women in India. Prime Minister Modi, in his Independence Day address in August of last year, was the first prime minister in that forum to address the plight of India's women. Usually these forums are like Independence Day speeches here in the United States, talking about how great India is and all the wonderful things, and hey, look at what an awesome country we are. But PM Modi took the time to talk about the women. And he talked about things we've been reading in the newspaper lately, about the rapes that have been very high profile, about discrimination against women, about female feticide, about the gender gap, about nutrition differences between men and women in India. He's not shied away from these topics. And he does so more than just for human rights reasons, which of course are very important, but he realizes a country that discriminates against half its population is not a country primed for high growth. And he realizes that a growing gender gap in India, and it is growing. India has one of the worst gender gaps in the entire region, second only to Afghanistan. This eventually is going to impact India's national security interests. It's going to impact India's economy. It's just not sustainable. And so he's rightly focused on the plight of women in India. He's also launched a campaign called Clean India. And what he's recognized is that the first thing foreigners think of when they come to India for the first time is the sanitation. I've had so many friends and colleagues come to me after visiting India, and they say, oh, India is a great country, but man, it's dusty. Man, it's really dirty around there. And that's not a narrative that Prime Minister Modi wants out there. He wants India to be seen as the place for high-tech industries. And high-tech industries require cleanliness and sanitation. And so he understands that to attract big-time foreign investment, he needs to clean India up. And so he's really launched this Make India campaign. In addition, he's staying out of sectarian and ideological issues. The controversies I alluded to earlier when he was chief minister of Gujarat stemmed from some riots that happened in 2002 when thousands of Muslims were killed. And Modi was accused of, at best, turning a blind eye to the riots, at worst, condoning them. And so there was a lot of concern that once he became prime minister, these sorts of issues would hamper his prime ministership. But he stayed away from them. As far as I know, since he's become prime minister, there have been no reports of active discrimination against Muslims or Christians or Sikhs or any other ethnic minority in India that has been condoned by his administration. And he doesn't seem to be pursuing a hard-right ideological agenda, which a lot of people feared. In fact, as I mentioned, everything seems to be laced with pragmatism. And finally, he's staying low-key on global geopolitics. As someone who follows national security issues, this is actually kind of drives me a little bit crazy about Prime Minister Modi. But again, it's very pragmatic. The situation in Ukraine, with Russia invading Ukraine and taking part of their country away from them, Prime Minister Modi hasn't said a single word about it yet. He stayed quiet on the crisis in Iraq that's going on right now. He stayed quiet on the Middle East peace process and the Israel-Palestine conflict. He, I think, has taken the calculation that there's nothing to be gained from speaking out for him on these topics, so he has stayed quiet. Similarly with climate change. He doesn't want to do anything that will undermine India's growth, and so he's not made any promises on emissions standards. As much as the United States wants him to, as much as they press him to, he said, listen, India's growth is first priority for me. And that's why he's trying to change the conversation to let's talk about clean technologies. Let's talk about solar panels. Let's talk about LED lighting. Let's talk about efficiency more than emissions caps, because he's focused on what's going to drive growth forward for India. And so he's got all these things going on. And I want to take a minute now to get back into the U.S.-India relationship. As Mr. Foster mentioned, a very timely topic. The president is on his way right now for the Republic Day celebrations on Monday as the chief guest of Prime Minister Modi. And I want to take a moment just to highlight how extraordinary this is. It's easy to overlook this fact, sitting here in the United States, but this really is an extraordinary moment. Back in 2013, and really since 2010, officials on both sides, both in the United States and India, had really soured on the U.S.-India relationship. I was in the administration at the time, and there was a lot of frustration. Many U.S. officials thought that India wasn't doing enough for the United States and that they should be more thankful for everything that the U.S. has done for them. Many in India thought that the U.S. was asking too much, that they didn't understand what India's priorities were. There's probably some truth in both sides, but there was a lot of frustration. And frankly, I think both sides ran out of gas a little bit. After years of really intense engagement, you had a government in Prime Minister Singh that was really on its last legs. You had frustration in the United States. You had attention turning towards domestic problems in the United States. And see, the relationship was really soured. And then in December of 2013, an Indian diplomat in New York gets arrested. And this really blows the relationship wide open. You had very, very senior ranking officials in both governments publicly sniping at each other. And this is something that had not been seen in U.S.-India relations since the Cold War, really. And there was a lot of talk on if the U.S., United States, and India could even recover from all of this. And so if you look at that point, early 2014, things looked very bleak. People were wondering what's going to happen between the United States and India. And now, 8 months later, the president is on his way to India for Republic Day. And this is very historic for a couple of reasons. One is that this is the first time a U.S. president has ever been invited for Republic Day in India. Republic Day, traditionally the prime minister invites a foreign leader to be his chief guest, to review the troops and watch the parade and take part in all the pomp. And this is the first time a U.S. president has been invited. And President Obama didn't hesitate when the invitation came in and accepted it right away. Second of all, for President Obama, he is the first U.S. president to visit India twice while in office. For all the talk about President Bush and what a great friend he was of India, he went once. President Clinton, he went once. Before President Clinton, it was Jimmy Carter, and he only went once. And what's more is President Obama was the first president to visit India within the first 2 years of his administration. And as I mentioned, he also invited Prime Minister Singh to be his first official state guest back in 2009. So you have a president who has really invested a lot personally in the relationship, building on what his predecessors had done for him. And what this visit is, it will be symbolic, yes, but it's about more than just symbolism. It's a chance to rebuild cooperation. And if there was a slogan that I could put on the U.S.-India relationship right now on this visit, it would be trade, 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 foreign investment, and more trade. And that's what we're going to see, hopefully, coming out of this visit on Monday and Tuesday. We might also see a few other announcements, like a 10-year defense framework deal. I've heard that that's in the works. And also maybe some movement on nuclear commerce. The nuclear deal that I mentioned before actually has stagnated since it was completed in 2010 for a variety of reasons. And this may be the spark plug that it needs to get things going again. So I'm hopeful about some movement on nuclear deal. Having personally invested almost 5 years of my life in it, I'd like to see it move forward. So hopefully we can do that. And so you have Prime Minister Modi, very strong mandate, implementing a pragmatic vision. Everything's great, right? This guy walks on water, right? Unfortunately, not quite. And moving forward, this is the big question. Is Modi really wants India to be a global power? But can he make India into a global power? India is not yet a global power. Ambassador Harish may disagree with me, but India is on its way to global power. And can Modi make it a global power? And there's a couple of questions. The first is, can he live up to his campaign promises and the high expectations he set for himself in 2014? Much like Barack Obama in 2008, expectations are very, very high, and he wants to move to fulfill them. He's made a lot of smart moves, but he still has a lot of work cut out for him. One is that he needs to build a powerful political coalition, which hasn't quite happened yet. For his mandate in the lower house of parliament, what often doesn't get talked about is that India has 2 houses of parliament, and in the upper house, Modi's party does not have a majority. And the upper house needs to approve anything that the lower house does for it to become law. So Modi still needs to reach out to the opposition, needs to reach out to other regional parties to get his legislation and his reforms passed. And that sort of political coalition building has not really happened yet. He also needs to build a strong coalition in another respect, and that is with the governments of the states. Economic reform and commerce in India is a little bit different than the United States in that the power is very decentralized. And state governments actually have a lot of authority over setting tariffs, over commerce that comes across its borders, and all sorts of other things, tax breaks, to lure companies into and lure commerce into their state. In fact, a lot of people say that this is why Modi was so successful as Chief Minister of Gujarat, because he had the tools that he needed to be able to make Gujarat into a place that was really attractive for foreign companies. At the national level, as Prime Minister of the entire country, he doesn't quite have those tools at his disposal. And the state governments, which would need to implement his reforms, are not all controlled by his party. A lot of them are still controlled by the Congress Party, and a lot of them are controlled by smaller regional parties. India's politics are very, very fractured, with hundreds of parties throughout the country. And so he needs still to build a strong coalition. And beyond that, he's said a lot of great things, he's made a lot of bold declarations, but we haven't seen a lot of really concrete actions yet, addressing some of the structural problems that India has. Things like infrastructure. India's infrastructure really needs an upgrade. And it's a big stumbling block and a big hurdle to having the kind of modern India that Modi really is envisioning. The other is skills in the workforce. There's still a question about whether the Indian workforce has what it takes to become a global power of this sort that can churn out and be really a leader in these new industries. And also, India's labor laws are very restrictive. It makes it very difficult for companies to hire and fire people and for there to be fluidity in the labor market. And all of these are things that Modi will need to address, which he hasn't quite done yet. He also needs to address some other issues in the country, mainly security. And let's be frank here. When we talk about security in India, we're talking about Pakistan, because Pakistan always has basically both eyes trained on India. And it's a big question what he's going to do on Pakistan and if he's going to move forward. There have been a lot of border skirmishes along the line of control in Kashmir recently. And, you know, border skirmishes are fairly constant between India and Pakistan, but recently they've really increased in terms of the frequency and the intensity of the skirmishes. And it's raised some questions about what India's relationship is going to be like. You have Prime Minister Modi's brand new Prime Minister. You have Nawaz Sharif in Pakistan, who's a relatively new Prime Minister as well, for the third time. And it's still not for certain how they're going to interact with each other and if they're going to be able to come to some sort of agreement. Modi, for certain, doesn't want a conflagration with Pakistan. Again, for his pragmatism, any sort of military conflict or war with Pakistan is going to distract everyone from what his goals are for India. But at the same time, he doesn't want to appear weak. And so he's not going to just let Pakistan get off the hook with whatever he believes that they are doing. And so this is an area where Modi really needs to clarify what he's going to do. And in addition to that, if you look beyond Pakistan, if you look to the rest of South Asia, Modi really needs to demonstrate that India can be a responsible regional power before it can be a global power. Afghanistan is the biggest example of this, with the U.S. drawdown of troops last month, and then in 2 years with a complete withdrawal. This is really a chance for India to demonstrate leadership. Already for the last 2 years, they have been training a lot of Afghan civil servants in how to run an effective government and really trying to build up Afghan institutions. And is Modi going to continue this work? Is he going to help Afghanistan get on its feet? Because without the United States, India is probably Afghanistan's biggest ally. And can India work with Afghanistan to ensure stability in the region? Because stability is what is needed if you want to have strong economic growth. The same with other countries in the region to a lesser extent. You talk about Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a brand new president that they just elected, actually on a big surprise as well. And India has enormous influence in Sri Lanka, and it remains to be seen how they're going to use that influence. And so for the world to take India seriously as a global power, India first needs to be seen as a strong regional power. And that's something that Modi really needs to address. And finally, sort of my pet peeve is I think Modi and India moving forward need to make the tough decisions on global foreign policy issues. India was on the United Nations Security Council in 2011 and 2012 for a 2-year term. And from the perspective of the United States and other Western powers, the term was disappointing because India did not just sort of kowtow to whatever the United States wanted. There were some in the United States government that really expected that India would do this. But of course, that's not how India conducts its foreign policy. It conducts it in, obviously, its own what's in its own national security interests. But what you saw was India not taking a stance on a lot of issues, on Libya, on Iran sanctions issues, on Russia and Ukraine. There were a lot of issues where India just refused to take a stance. Historically, since the Cold War and since independence, India has been part of what's called a non-aligned movement, where they've said, we don't want to take sides in any of these global issues. We are going to straddle the fence, and we're going to not make an opinion. And that served India well for 40 to 50 years and really allowed them to stay out of the fray. It really allowed them to really not get too much involved in the Cold War. But those days are gone. And if India really wants to be a global power, it has to show that it can take on the responsibilities of a global power. India keeps talking that it wants the responsibilities and the status of a global power, but it hasn't yet been able to articulate what it would do with that power. Is it going to stand for Western values and traditional values that United States and UK and Japan and Germany stand for? Or is it going to stand with Iran and North Korea and other countries of concern? And this is a decision that India hasn't made yet. And for it to be a global power, it really needs to make these decisions. And so just to conclude, where do we see Modi right now? Modi has done a lot of good, right? He's gotten people talking about India again. He's sparked enthusiasm. Everyone is excited about India again. All of my colleagues that I talked to said there's renewed enthusiasm. In the private sector, people are dusting off old plans about investing in India in anticipation of Modi's economic reforms. He's seen as a government that's friendly to business interests, which is a stark contrast to the previous government, which was seen a little bit hostile to foreign businesses. And he's made good strides already in the economic arena. But the bottom line is that he's got a lot more work to do before India can really be a global power. Personally, I think India will be a global power, but it's going to take probably about 20 to 25 more years. And I think Modi can get the country there, and I'm excited to see what he has in mind for the rest of his term. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions that anyone has. And Kelly, is there...
We're circulating mics, so just raise your hand if you have a question, and our volunteers. You just talk into it, sir.
Okay. Why Modi has got this habit of making foolish statements during the campaign and after he became the Prime Minister? For example, once he said India should have more toilets than temples. How can a devout Hindu, an RSS Hindu, can say such words comparing toilets to a temple? Of course, we all know that India is not a very clean country. Okay, I can keep on quoting so many other things. Okay, Lord Ganesha, you know, he recently said in Bombay by Modi, we worship Lord Ganesha. There must have been some plastic surgery at that time who get an elephant held on the body and a human being. Okay, first of all, it is a story, it's not a real thing. So, he's a learned, it was attended mainly by physician. You know, nobody asked him a question back. Why do you make such a foolish statement? Okay.
Yeah.
Next one. Okay. In Mahabharata, there's a Karna. You know the Karna story, okay? Karna is born out of wombs. That's the way the story goes. And that shows India had genetic science even at that time. These are all wrong statements. Okay, then I will give you another example. Famous,
Yeah. Yes, it's a very good point. During the campaign, then Chief Minister Modi did make some foolish statements. And as to why he made those statements, I can't speak to his mindset. What I can say is I know that in the heat of campaign, and this happens in the United States a lot too, is that candidates make foolish statements sometimes. And I don't know what prompted those. I actually don't know the context of those comments right there. What I do know is that he was focused so relentlessly on his economic message and on his message of growth that maybe he wasn't thinking so sharply about the other issues. And actually, Ambassador Harish, if you have anything to add here, I would welcome your perspective. Thank you.
Yes.
Can you stand up kindly and tell me your name as well?
Yeah, Alan. Recently, both ISIS and Al-Qaeda have made statements that India is a ripe territory for them to establish cells. I mean, the world is very concerned about these expansions, but with India's past record of minority violence, the largest or one of the largest Islamic populations, what do you think the future holds in that area, and is this a serious threat?
In terms of Al-Qaeda, I have to be honest that I don't view Al-Qaeda as a serious threat to India by itself. When they came out and announced that India was a target for them, I saw it more as an intention-getting tactic. Because the worldwide conversation had basically shifted to ISIS, and no one was talking about Al-Qaeda anymore. And to me, it was very much a plea for attention. So I don't view Al-Qaeda as a serious threat to India. That being said, there are many other terrorist groups that are a serious threat to India. And a lot of them are based in Pakistan. And this is what I talked about when I talked about security issues, was that for companies to set up in India, they need to be certain that they're going to be safe from terrorist attack. And honestly, right now, this is what separates India and Pakistan in terms of economic development, is that India is a relatively safe country. They do have, occasional attacks. Some of them are homegrown, some of them are foreign, but Pakistan is basically under siege right now. And since 2008, since the Mumbai attacks, India has actually made immense strides in upgrading its security infrastructure and its capabilities to ward off terrorist attacks. If there was any silver lining that came out of the Mumbai attacks, it was a huge increase in cooperation between the United States and the UK and India on counterterrorism issues. And so I think this is something that the Prime Minister and India as a whole is taking very seriously.
Corbett Parker, you
Hi.
talked about reducing regulations and labor laws. Can you kind of talk about some of the concrete examples as maybe going after some of that corruption? I mean, perhaps that was some of the red tape. Is it more on the taxation side? And maybe just compare it with some of the dialogue you see here among the states, when it comes to, California, that's kind of seen as, I guess, where India is, and Texas, where India wants to go. Is that a fair analogy?
Of course, yes, Texas is where everyone wants to go, right? Let me just make sure I understand your question. You just want examples of what Modi actually has done in terms, yeah. Right, and so I think the answer to that question is that what he needs to do is he needs to work with the states, right, to get them to uniformly change their tax structures and their tariff structures. Some of the states are still, controlled by very leftist governments that are hostile to this sort of reform, and so he needs to work very closely with them. And there are two states that have made actually a lot of progress. One is Gujarat, where Modi was chief minister, and you can see that in his 13 years as chief minister, a lot of companies set up shop there because he improved the infrastructure, he reduced tariffs, and he did all these things. Another is West Bengal, honestly. Even though that state was ruled by communists for so long, counterintuitively, they were very sort of pragmatic on economic reforms. So these are the things he's trying to emulate at the national level. And he hasn't quite gotten there yet. He's talked about it a lot, but only 8 months in, he still has a lot of work to do. So I think the biggest action on corruption is changing out of all the ministers that were in the Congress government, because there was, I think, after 10 years, so much patronage, and it was just so endemic. So that alone, I think, was a big step. The other sort of concrete actions I've heard is that he's issued a lot of the poor people. I forget the exact term, but they're basically like debit cards that can be directly loaded with funds from the central government or the state government. They're bypassing all the middlemen that would normally touch the money. And the popular statistic that is often read is that when the central government allocates money to help the poor, only about 10% actually gets there, because everyone on the way down takes their cut. And he found a way to bypass all of that. So I think that is a really good example of a concrete way he's trying to reduce the corruption.
Hi, I'm Swati Narayan. Had a question to ask you about distribution, because I haven't read or seen anything about distribution, and I know that you've talked about infrastructure, but when you look at India's rural villages, there is no way to get merchandise from point A to point B, and that's a big problem because everybody has internet access. People want to be able to order things. They want to be able to. I work with a lot of NGOs, and they'll manufacture things, but getting it from wherever point A to point B is virtually impossible. And like logistics company, I never read anything about it, never hear anything about it, but I feel that's a huge problem that India has right now. And so, can you elaborate any on that and tell me what Modi's plans are for that?
Well, I agree with you. It's a huge problem, infrastructure and logistics, particularly from the rural areas into the urban centers, which was where a lot of this distribution used to happen, and frankly, going the other way. Unfortunately, I can't elaborate on what Prime Minister Modi's plans are in this regard, because this is one of the areas where I haven't heard a lot about what his plans are. It's going to take a huge investment to upgrade the logistics, the distribution networks, and allow the logistical capabilities, something in billions and billions of dollars. And I haven't seen any concrete proposals.
Don't you agree that that's vital for India?
I agree. I
And
agree.
And to not hear or read anything about it is just kind of astounding.
I agree. It's one of the challenges that Modi is going to have to address. So I agree with you 100%.
My name is Kush. I just wanted to raise that IMF issued a statement that possibly by 2016 India's growth rate would be faster than China's. But let me paraphrase Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen was here last year. The Indian economic pie is not diverse enough. I mean, the economic pie right now depends on software, pharmaceuticals, and automobile spare parts. And what is Modi government, do they have a vision to diversify the economic pie? That's my question.
Thank you for that question, and I believe they do. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, I think Modi has a vision that India is going to become the center for these new industries, such as solar panels, LED lighting. We're starting to see some of these industries already pop up. I think Tata started making a small car that's sort of available to every man. They've really upgraded their defense production capabilities. So I think Modi really does want to diversify because he realizes that you can't have the immense growth that you're talking about on such an unlimited industrial sector.
Jagdeep Ahluwalia with the Indo-American Chamber. I just wanted to point out that we were in Delhi in December at an infrastructure summit, and Harris County Judge Ed Emmett was with us. We met Nitin Gadkari, the infrastructure minister, and he very clearly pointed out that they were working on both the first mile and the last mile in the infrastructure chain. So to answer your question, the first mile from the village and the last mile to the port or the final user is very important to them. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you for pointing that out. That's great to hear. I unfortunately have not had the privilege of speaking to the infrastructure minister, but it's great to hear that he's focused on it.
Paresh Patel. I first make a comment. I'd say that President Bush had quite a role in transforming the U.S.-India relationship, right, with the civil nuclear agreement, and applaud your efforts in being part of that process. I would ask you, the personal gestures aside, does the Obama administration have such a defining moment or deliverable in their remaining time in office? Can we expect perhaps something like a BIT to finally come to fruition? Or that's something that may lead up to an eventual free trade agreement between the U.S. and India?
That's a great question, and one that gets asked a lot in terms of what's going to be Obama's signature achievement with India. And honestly, from my perspective, including from my time in the administration, I don't think there is going to be one signature achievement. And honestly, I think the relationship has matured to the point where what's exciting about the relationship is the interactions that are happening in all sorts of issues and all sorts of levels. Last I heard, the U.S. and India had something like 27 different working groups to work on all sorts of different issues regarding trade, environment, bilateral investment. And to me, that's the real exciting part about the U.S.-India relationship, is that no matter who comes into office now, it should be on a positive trajectory, that the path should be forward. That it's sort of moved beyond the realm of being subject to the whims of individual personalities. And so I don't see a big, significant, bold initiative, but I do see sort of steady growth and closer ties moving forward.
Yes, hello, Ian Overton. I appreciate your talk, but I have to take issue with your narrative, especially the way that you characterized choice of relationships, because I didn't hear you say anything at all about India's role in the BRICS nations. But when Modi came into power, he talked about needing a mass movement for development, like Gandhi had a mass movement for peace. But you put forward this concept that India must choose between the Western nations like Germany, the UK, or the United States, which are effectively bankrupt. The financial system is blowing out. They're bailing out worthless derivatives, and it's all falling apart. So, or choosing between that and North Korea and Iran. I find that funny because what India seems to be engaging in through the BRICS and the SCO and other nations like that, international organizations like that, is, these countries represent almost half the planet in terms of population. They're moving for things like international rail development along the new Silk Road. They're moving for nuclear power development. And they're standing together, and they're actually peacefully resolving border conflicts that had been ongoing for decades. So I find that the fact that you missed this whole development from your speech very striking, and I think you might want to reconsider that and address these very important developments.
Thank you. The SCO, for people who are not familiar with it, is a Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's a political amalgamation of countries, India and China being the two most prominent, that do have focused a lot on international development. So I think you're absolutely right to point out the good work that they've been doing. The SCO, though, unfortunately, has also been very sort of not supportive of efforts to maintain peace and security and stability around the region. And they've really been at crossroads with things that the Western powers are trying to do. And so it's a tale, it's a tale of two different priorities, right? And SCO has done a lot of good work, but in terms of India being seen as a global power, in terms of global geopolitics, it really hasn't taken a stance yet. And so development work is very important, and I don't want to diminish that in any way. But to be seen as a real global power, you have to be really involved in global geopolitics. Sorry. Who has the mic right now?
Hi, this is Jasprit Singh. I'm sorry, I have a swollen ankle and an ankle brace, so if you don't mind, I'll ask my question sitting down. I actually have a question just building upon gentleman over here that raised. You made a very striking comment about India and Prime Minister Modi himself not having a very strong view or taking sides on most of the geopolitical issues, be it Ukraine, Russia, be it Middle East policy, be it Iran, sanctions in Iran. But neither has China. And China surely is years ahead of India in being a superpower. Do you see a scenario where India and China, or maybe even the BRICS, which constitute a much bigger population, have an alternate scenario in how they want to look at geopolitical issues and how they want to have a new value system in how you conduct affairs? Currently, it's been Western, non-Western. There could be a third scenario with India and China aligning and not always aligning, but at least having a different view on how they take international affairs.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In China, you're right, it hasn't taken a view on these issues either. But that kind of reinforces my point that does India, in its quest for global power status, does it want to be seen as a global power in the mold of a large democracy, or does it want to be seen as a global power in the mold of a communist country? And that's a decision that India has to take. And I could very much envision a scenario like the one you described, where they have a sort of a third view on how these global geopolitical events should be handled. But I don't view India and China as cooperating all that much. They may both abstain and not take views, but I don't view them as collaborating much in global geopolitics. But let's say that situation does come to fruition. I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear if they have alternative viewpoints on how these global issues can be handled. Then let's talk about them.
Time for one last question.
I'm Ravi Mani. I have a question about what Prime Minister Modi's plan is for the privatization of the public sector. One of the things that everybody is hoping for, and somebody mentioned about the issues with regards to infrastructure, especially for food. India is actually can be a net food exporting country because there's so much food that's wasted. About 20% of the food actually rots. So what is Modi's answer in terms of privatization? We haven't heard a whole lot because that's one of the things that I think the rest of the world is looking for some answers.
Yeah, I think that this is part of Prime Minister Modi's plan, is to privatize industries that have been state-controlled for a long time, but really don't make sense to be under state control. I think the airline, Air India, is a great example of this. The national flag carrier of India is still basically a state-controlled entity, and it's had to be bailed out by the government numerous times because of operating inefficiencies and rupturing and hemorrhaging money, and really not running a very efficient or basically being a desirable airline to fly on. And to me, with the proliferation of so many other airlines in India now, it makes perfect sense to privatize Air India. And I think that's the judgment that Modi, I hope, is coming to, and I believe that he's coming to that, and I believe he's coming to that on a number of other industries as well. But I think privatization is a really important factor for India's growth. So thank you all for coming, and I appreciate all of your patience. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you all for coming out this evening. It's 2015. We have an exciting slate of programs, so I hope you all take a moment to look at the back of your program and see, or the inside of your program and see some of the other upcoming programs that we have. Think, as with anything, only time will tell in terms of how Modi continues to position India. All the ingredients are there, but we will see what comes next. So thank you for joining us, and please again help me in thanking Dr. Anish Goel.